The rumors seem to be true that Pete DeBoer will be the next head coach of the Dallas Stars. And on today's episode, we will talk about what that could look like for this franchise. Is this a good decision? Was it the right decision? Or is it a decision that the front office will be regretting? We'll cover it all on today's episode of Locked On Stars.
Your Locked On Stars, your daily podcast on the Dallas Stars. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Howdy, Stars fans. Welcome back to the Locked On Stars podcast, the only daily podcast covering the Dallas Stars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. I'm your host, Dane Lewis, your local expert on all things Dallas Stars hockey, credentialed member of the Stars Media, coming to you on this Tuesday, June 21st. And whether this is your first time here or you are a recurring listener, thank you for stopping in and for making Locked On Stars your first listen of the day. Be sure to subscribe to and follow our show if you do not do so already, whether that's on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform. Remember that we are free and available no matter where or how you listen. You can also find me on Twitter at Dane_Lewis and our show as well at Locked On Stars. Thank you guys again for tuning in. And we are here to talk about some pretty substantial news within the Dallas Stars franchise. As I'm sure many of you have seen the reports from Elliot Friedman, a pretty credible NHL media member. It looks like the deal is all but set in stone that Pete DeBoer, former head coach of the Vegas Golden Knights this past season, coach of the San Jose Sharks in the past, the New Jersey Devils, and I believe a short stint with the Florida Panthers as well. It seems that he will be the next head coach of the Dallas Stars. At the time of recording this, around 7:30 on Monday evening, there has not been an official deal released, but it looks like it's going to be around a 4-year deal worth a little over $4 million per season. Again, at the time of recording this, none of that set in stone. Maybe by the time you're hearing this on Tuesday or later in the week, there has been a deal officially announced by the Stars front office and organization, but the writing seems to be on the wall. This has been in speculation ever since DeBoer and Rick Bowness were let go, fired, stepped away, whatever you want to call it, from their respective teams. And man, this is a move for me personally that I don't think the word for me is upset or angry. I think I'm just disappointed and underwhelmed by this move. The Dallas Stars were and still are in desperate need of a huge change for the offense for the team. Obviously, the defense has been the identity for quite some time, so there's a need to uphold that identity and continue to produce strong defensive-minded teams. But I think at the end of the day, what the Dallas Stars are maybe in need of was a man who could come in, run the team, turn the offense around, obviously. But there was obviously, I think, a need for some, game-changing culture for this seemingly new era of Dallas Stars hockey. We talk about it all the time with these new prospects coming up throughout the organization. Obviously, some of the better young players in this organization are on the NHL roster now. And there's just kind of this sense that we are stepping into this new era of Dallas Stars hockey where Sagan and Ben are no longer the front focus of this organization. It's Robertson, it's Hintz, it's Ottinger. And with that, I think the Stars were in need of a new coach who could come in and help kind of set the bar and set this new standard for excellence here in Dallas, because this is a town that, even though it might not be considered a hockey town, that there's a lot of pride within this fan base and high expectations every season for the Stars team to be competitive and not just to make the playoffs or win a couple playoff series every season, but to eventually win the Stanley Cup. And we've even seen that, just as of recently, a couple years ago, the Stars got within 2 wins of bringing the cup back to Dallas. And you saw how the fans reacted. I'm sure many of you were locked into that entire playoff run. You were excited to see the Stars perform the way that they did. And that's the standard now that I feel like will be in the back of our minds as Stars fans and watchers for years to come. And with Pete DeBoer, the question is, can he do that? I mean, this is a guy that has had some pretty good success with some of his past teams. He's made some appearances in the Stanley Cup Finals. He's made some really good runs to the conference finals, but he's never been able to get the job done with his teams. How much of it is actually his fault? It's kind of a case-by-case basis, whether there's injuries or other things affecting the team's play, or just running into a really good team that was going to be difficult to beat in whatever round of the playoffs you were playing them in. But this is just, I feel like a very safe pick for the Dallas Stars. I mean, obviously, Jim Nill has a new, his contract will be expiring soon. He's wanting to, make sure that he's able to prolong his time in the front office in Dallas. So this makes sense from the GM perspective. But I think as fans, we can't help but feel just a little disappointed and a little underwhelmed by this hire. I mean, obviously, we talked about guys like Mark Savard, who doesn't have NHL coaching experience, but I personally think could have been a really interesting hire that could have paid huge dividends, just given his relationship with a few of the guys already on the team. Obviously, he coached Wyatt Johnston with the Windsor Spitfires this past year, who had one of the best seasons in the OHL that we've seen in recent memory. But now Savard looks like he will be a candidate for another job, potentially Boston, where he did win the Stanley Cup in 2011. But again, cannot harp on this enough, how just bland and safe of a pick this appears to be. I mean, it's like the Stars are, riding bikes with other teams in the NHL. Every team in the NHL is represented by a little kid riding a bike, and the Stars have had their training wheels on. And instead of, looking to take the training wheels off and take a risk and try to, speed things up, they keep the training wheels on and they keep playing it safe. And they go with the name of a coach who's been around the league for a while, who obviously does have some success. This is not a bad coach necessarily in every aspect of what being a coach requires. But when you talk about training wheels, I mean, you're not going to go as fast. You're not going to be able to keep up with some of the other kids that are riding their bikes. You're not going to be able to keep up with some of these other organizations who are making big moves in the coaching position, who are going out and getting big name free agents or making big trades for big pieces. And obviously the Stars are paying guys like Sagan and Ben quite a bit of money that can hinder some of those movements. But still, I think head coach, that there maybe could have been some other options worth exploring rather than just going with the biggest name on the market, which I feel like DeBoer probably was one of the biggest names left after Bruce Cassidy was hired by the Vegas Golden Knights. It's just like the Stars front office, playing, Madden football on the Xbox, on the PlayStation, and they hit the Ask Coach, the Ask Madden feature, and they chose whatever the coach suggested to them. I mean, sometimes that works, but sometimes it's also an absolute disaster and does nothing. Dallas really kind of looking for a fresh start this season, really could have done something huge by hiring a guy like Savard, or even before Cassidy got picked up by the Vegas Golden Knights. I think that could have been an interesting move. I didn't, love or hate Barry Trotz potentially being the new coach. I just think that this is a very safe hire. It feels very generic, very bland, underwhelming, nothing eventful or, oh my gosh, this takes us to the next level of potentially being a cup contender. I don't think it necessarily makes us worse, at least as of right now. But we're once again kind of let down by the Stars organization, which, I hate to, put words in the mouth of the front office or other coaches or players, but this just seems like an organization that ever since the Stanley Cup run a couple years ago has kind of settled into this area of mediocrity. And I'm afraid that a hire like this could help, encourage that type of behavior within the organization. That is the last thing we want to see, especially with so many players, so many gifted players that are not mediocre, that we've already talked about on today's show and that we've talked about at length on other episodes. We're, of course, going to talk about this hire a little bit more and my biggest concern with Pete DeBoer after a quick break. Today's episode of Locked On Stars is brought to you by our friends at Built Bar. Built Bar has truly outdone themselves with their newest flavor, Mud Pie. And for the first time ever, Built is introducing a new flavor, this Mud Pie flavor, in both Built Bar form and Built Bar Puff form. The new Mud Pie bar is rich whipped cream and chocolate mousse smothered in 100% real chocolate and topped with cookies and cream crumble. Mud Pie is packed with 16 grams of protein, only 150 calories, and 8 grams of sugar. It's like your mom baked the most delicious, creamy chocolate mud pie and wrapped it up just for you. This limited time flavor is delicious and it will sell fast, so you will want to visit Built.com to get yours today. You can go to Built Bar's website, Built.com, right now and use the promo code LOCK15 and you can get 15% off your order. Again, use the promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off your order at Built.com. We're moving on this Tuesday episode of Locked On Stars. This is your host, Dane Lewis, at Dane_Lewis on Twitter. Thank you again for making Locked On Stars your first listen of the day, continuing to talk about the hiring or potential hiring of Pete DeBoer as the next head coach in Dallas for the Stars. And as I'm sure many of you know, Pete DeBoer was fired from the Vegas Golden Knights at the end of this past season after failing to make the playoffs for the first time in the franchise's brief existence. They did fire Pete DeBoer. Vegas Golden Knights have now hired another fired coach in Bruce Cassidy from the Boston Bruins to now take over their team. And DeBoer, I mean, obviously getting fired typically would lead you to assume that things were not really good in terms of the coach relationship with either the players or the front office or a mixture of both. And that is certainly the case with DeBoer, and it has got me concerned for how his relationship could be with guys here in Dallas, but especially with Jake Ottinger. Obviously, like I said, a less than ideal exit for Pete DeBoer from Las Vegas. And obviously, there were a lot of things this past season that were not necessarily in his control. Plenty of teams were hindered by the injury bug this past season, but the Vegas Golden Knights got to be up there at the top of the list with, at the start of the season, you look at the roster that they had, and obviously they added Jack Eichel early in the season, and you would think that that would be one of the better rosters in the NHL, and you would probably be right. And there was even flashes early in the season that led us to believe that Vegas was going to win the Pacific Division pretty easily and make a decent playoff run. But obviously that did not happen. There were plenty of injuries dealt to the Vegas Golden Knights: Mark Stone, Max Pacioretty, Jack Eichel, and of course, Robin Lehner, the goalie for the Vegas Golden Knights this past season. And that is one of the biggest reasons why I'm concerned with Jake Ottinger and his relationship with Pete DeBoer this coming season. As I'm sure many of you know, there was a lot of hostility, it seemed, between those two at the end. Robin Lehner was injured at one point in the season, was trying to play through it. Obviously, it was hindering the way that he was able to play, or really lack thereof. And it seemed like DeBoer kept putting him out there. And then finally, when Robin Lehner decided to shut things down, get surgery, and end his season, there seemed to be quite a bit of criticism from DeBoer saying that, Lehner was not willing to fight with this team in the midst of them pushing for a playoff spot, because they were in the playoff race up until the very end of the season, eventually losing out to the Stars and the Predators. But just a lot of what seemed like bad blood and just not seeing eye to eye, and obviously a little bit of animosity, it seems like, from DeBoer's side towards a guy like Robin Lehner, who it's hard to question his toughness. I mean, even just reading up on Robin Lehner before recording this episode, obviously he was a Vezina Trophy finalist when he was with the New York Islanders, but he's overcome so much in his career. He at one point struggled with alcohol addiction early in his NHL career, was able to fight that, overcome that, become a Vezina Trophy finalist, won the Bill Masterton Trophy in 2018-2019, a trophy given to players who show perseverance and a ton of fight. I mean, this is a guy that has been through a ton in his career, has really cleaned up his life, and become one of the better goalies in the NHL in recent years. So it's hard to question a guy like that. If he says he's hurt and he says he needs surgery, he's probably telling the truth there. This is a guy that doesn't really seem to back down from being competitive, especially on a team, like I said, looking to make the postseason in a crowded Western Conference. I believe if Robin Lehner was healthy, that he 100% would have suited up and played if he was able to do so, but he was doing what was best for him, what was best for his long-term health, best for his family, and I can respect that. But it seemed like there was a little bit of animosity. Maybe it was coming from the front office, and Pete DeBoer was just trying to be that middleman, and maybe some things were missaid, but it just led to a lot of eyes being shifted on Vegas, as if there weren't already so many eyes shifted on them to see whether or not they would crumble under the pressure of needing to make the postseason and keep that streak alive. And so obviously Jake Ottinger has not dealt with a ton of injuries early on in his career, but this is one of those things where if something like that does happen, if he faces injuries or he faces some struggles, could there be that animosity from DeBoer again to Jake Ottinger, who is at a different point in his career than Robin Lehner? Robin Lehner obviously is a lot older of a player. He's been in this league for a little bit longer. Ottinger at 23 years old still has quite a ways to go, and you could argue has some of his best hockey still yet to be played, which is crazy to think about given the year that he just had. But it would make me sick to my stomach. It makes me sick to my stomach even thinking about it. If Jake Ottinger's career is ruined, seems like a strong word, but just thrown off or set back a couple years, or if Ottinger looks to go to play for a different team, all because he cannot see eye to eye with his head coach. I'm not predicting that this will happen. I hope this doesn't happen, but it is certainly a concern for me going into this season. And it even stretches beyond the goalie situation. I would hate for DeBoer to be in charge of this team and ruin an experience for another young player, whether it's Jason Robertson, who still hasn't signed a new contract with the Stars. Rope Hintz is going to be due for a contract at the end of next season. Obviously, still tons of prospects who we would want to eventually see at the NHL level, like Maverick Bourque, Wyatt Johnston, Logan Stankoven, Antonio Stranges. The list goes on and on there. This is a situation that DeBoer needs to tread lightly and look to establish a good relationship with his players, with his front office, with the staff, and again, try to bring that good, healthy culture to the locker room and to the organization. Is that something he's always been known for? Not necessarily. I mean, DeBoer seems like a pretty, straight business, no nonsense kind of guy who looks to get results. A lot of times he does get those results, but sometimes it seems like it's at the cost of a relationship with a player or a front office member. And again, I talked about it a little bit earlier, but Jim Nill is, I believe, making this hire, to help himself out and, hopefully help the Stars team be competitive and for them to have a good season. So that way he's able to get a new contract at the end of next season and stay in this position a little bit longer. And he has said, like any other GM would say for any other team, that he thinks the future is bright and that he obviously wants to help guide this team back to winning a Stanley Cup. Whether Pete DeBoer is that guy, still to be determined, still managing my thoughts on it. Obviously, we've talked a lot on today's episode about some of the negatives and some of the hesitancies I have, but I do have some good thoughts and some positive thoughts that we can look to the upside of this hire, and we'll talk about it after another quick break. And we're closing out today's episode of Locked On Stars, continuing to talk about Pete DeBoer being the new head coach in Dallas, coaching the Stars to start the 2022-2023 season. And I've been pretty critical this episode. I've shown a little bit more of the negative side, a lot of hesitancy with this hire, a little bit of unhappiness with this hire, with how safe and bland and a little bit predictable it could have been. But all in all, I don't think that this is an awful hire. I don't think this is, a hire where you say, wow, this is a terrible coach. This team is going to get drastically worse. What is happening? What is the front office doing? Although I also don't think that this pushes the Dallas Stars from a team that makes the first round of the playoffs and instantly becomes a Stanley Cup contender. I do think that the Stars still have a good chance this season, as of right now, to make the playoffs and be a competitive team this coming season, even with Pete DeBoer at the helm. I think I was even texting a friend on Monday about the situation and kind of a group text I have, and he made a point that DeBoer is kind of a guy similar to Jim Montgomery, who can be, kind of a stone cold, get results kind of guy. And there were moments where that was working with Jim Montgomery. Obviously, Monty did not have an ideal ending with the Dallas Stars organization, but you can't argue that even before he was getting fired, the Stars were doing pretty well in that 2019-2020 season. Losing streak aside at the COVID pause, they were having a really solid season that got them into the round robin in the bubble and eventually got them placed in the playoffs where they were put at, that helped lead them to their Stanley Cup run under the leadership of Rick Bowness. But DeBoer, a similar guy, maybe a little bit different of a coaching style, a guy who has a little bit of an aspect of maybe could make the offense a little bit better, but still runs a similar defense to a guy like Bowness, or even a little bit similar to Barry Trotz. Obviously not the exact same, but there are some similarities there. And you talk about playoff success. I mean, Pete DeBoer has been to the Stanley Cup Finals a handful of times. In the 2011-2012 season, he went there with the New Jersey Devils, and he went with the San Jose Sharks in 2015-2016. And both of those seasons were his first with those respective teams. And then even in his first season in Vegas in 2019-2020, he did take the Vegas Golden Knights to the Western Conference Finals, where they eventually lost in 5 games to the Dallas Stars. So if you can't beat them, join them. I mean, the Stars also kept the Vegas Golden Knights out of the playoffs this past season by getting that tie with the Arizona Coyotes, and I believe it was the second to last game of the season. Getting that 1 point helped make the distance wide enough where the Vegas Golden Knights could not make the playoffs. So 2 years, or I guess 2 years out of the last 3 seasons, the Stars have been responsible for sending the Vegas Golden Knights home early. And also, you even look at that San Jose Cup run, 2015-2016. Joe Pavelski was a member of that team and had his third best statistical season. So maybe there could be some kind of reconnection between Joe Pavelski and Pete DeBoer that could be beneficial for that top line. I think that could be an interesting storyline to follow. And even you look at this past season in Vegas, the Vegas Golden Knights were 12th in the NHL in goals for. I think the Dallas Stars were 21st. They were 18th in the NHL in goals against, meaning the lower you are on the list, the better you are. They only allowed 244 goals on the season. The best team in the league, and that was Carolina with 200. So there's a little bit of a marker there. A pretty solid defensive and offensive team, despite the amount of injuries that were stacked up. I mean, obviously people wanted to laugh and make jokes at the expense of the Golden Knights for not making the postseason, but they still put up some decent numbers in some areas of the game, even with all these injuries, and still almost made the postseason. Had it not been, again, for the Dallas Stars being a little bit healthier and the Nashville Predators with the play of guys like Roman Josi and UC Saros and Philip Forsberg. Just don't ask me about the special teams on the Vegas Golden Knights. That was definitely not one of the better parts of their past season. But again, you have to take injuries into account, and hopefully that's something that could be better with the Stars, depending on what their roster looks like at the start of this next season. But all in all, at the end of the day, I hope Pete DeBoer has been able to learn from his past mistakes, take all of this experience that he has from coaching his previous teams, bring that knowledge to Dallas, and hopefully help make this team a true playoff contender where they're not just looking to make the postseason, but again, make those deep postseason runs and eventually bring the Stanley Cup back to Texas. And hopefully DeBoer can find some redemption for his career. He has obviously been under a lot of criticism in the past several seasons, and even as of late, even as of right now. And of course, one of the reasons that we love sports so much is guys seeking to get redemption, make things right, and eventually right their wrongs and become a hero despite all of their shortcomings. And maybe that's what will happen with DeBoer here in Dallas. So I personally am skeptical as of right now, but also a little bit curious and optimistic to see what this season will look like under the leadership of Pete DeBoer as head coach of the Dallas Stars. We will be following his journey as head coach throughout this offseason very closely into training camp and, of course, into the regular season as well. But that's going to do it for today's episode of Locked On Stars. Thank you so much again for tuning in, for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen of the day, check out the Locked On NHL podcast. They are covering the Stanley Cup Finals like no other. These are local experts covering both the Colorado Avalanche and the Tampa Bay Lightning in their pursuit for the Cup, as well as any other NHL news that could come about during this time. Be sure to subscribe to and follow our show on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform. Leave a comment, a rating, or a review if you like what you hear. It truly does help the show out a ton. Be sure to continue to tune in here every single weekday, Monday through Friday, as we continue to navigate this offseason for the Dallas Stars. As the season draws to a close, we are getting closer and closer to free agency, to trades being made, to the NHL draft. Very, very exciting time here in the world of hockey, even though there will be really no games on in the NHL. Still plenty to talk about here at Locked On Stars, and we got you covered every Monday through Friday. We'll see you back here tomorrow, Stars fans. Have a great day.